All right, let's begin. I feel like I was just in this room. Welcome and thanks for coming out to this edition of the Humanities Forum, which is tied into the Humanities Program and is at the service of the Development of Western Civilization Program. We are very, very happy to welcome to our campus for the second time Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things magazine, the premier magazine of politics and Catholicism in the United States.
Not just
Catholicism and other and Judaism and Protestantism who put first things first. Does that work? Okay. We'll edit that out in the official. I can say that it's a special pleasure for me. I met Rusty about 21 years ago, I think. A woman that was working at Creighton, who I knew from graduate school, called me up because we were living in Leavenworth, Kansas, and she said, "Jim, you've got to come up to or across or wherever. Is it up? Yeah, I don't know. To Creighton to meet this guy." And I said, "Oh, well, what about him?" She said, "Well, he's sort of like you," which she meant wrong in virtually every important area of human life. And so I came up and got to know Rusty and have known him ever since. A few things about him. He was a lacrosse player, I think a very fearsome one, at Haverford University in Pennsylvania. He graduated, he got his PhD from Yale Divinity School during its glory days, which are now a little bit past. But at that time, it was going strong. He worked at Creighton for, I don't know how many years, 20 years, and succeeded the great and great and blessed memory, Richard John Newhouse, as the editor of First Things. And in many ways, if you follow that magazine, revived it. And also, I believe that one of the great contributions it makes is really bringing up the question of politics, the intersection of politics and religion, anew in a globalized world. The last book that he published, he's published other books, is one of his books that we did on heroism and Christianity was a subject of a conference that we did, 12 years ago. His latest book is Resurrecting, the Idea of a Christian Society. The idea of a Christian society here refers to a great essay by T.S. Eliot, so revisiting that topic. And so, without further ado, let's welcome Russell Ronald, it's a great middle name, Reno III. Good, you got it.
It's green lights on. Okay, good. Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. I don't want to go through my book. I'm tired of it already, and so I wanted to break new ground today. T.S. Eliot in 1939, when he delivered lectures in 1939 that were eventually published as The Idea of a Christian Society, he was taking the measure of the crises of the 1930s that were building and ultimately broke out into war shortly after his lectures were published. And in that, he wants to analyze, if you will, the spiritual nature of that crisis and then propose a way forward. Today, what I want to do is I want to do something, the crises that we face are less dire, but I think we all feel them. And I don't so much want to offer a spiritual diagnosis as to offer what I hope is a persuasive analysis of why we feel that we're in a time of crisis, and then propose a way for us to think about that crisis that draws on Catholic social doctrine. So that's my agenda or my game plan for this afternoon. So my title is a little bit different. It's Reading the Signs of the Times. In 1977, a neo-Nazi group marched in Skokie, Illinois. The Holocaust was a living memory for some 7,000 residents of Skokie, which is just north of Chicago. And the men who had fought in Europe during World War II were still alive. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 was barely a decade old. And in the run-up to the march, there was a great deal of controversy and anxiety that it would lead to conflicts and problems. But the march itself turned out to be anticlimactic. And the Skokie March of 1977 entered our popular mythology as a shining triumph of free speech rather than as a sign of resurgent anti-Semitism and racism. In other words, after this march of Nazis in Skokie, people were reassured rather than unsettled. Compare this to Charlottesville. 30 years later, those with a living memory of real Nazis have largely passed from the scene. The courageous men and women who marched at Selma are now bent with age. And yet, the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville was not anticlimactic. It triggered violent confrontations, national soul-searching, and a campaign for the lustration, the cleansing of public life that contributes, it seems to me, to a growing worry that everything will be swept away in a kind of panicked quest for moral purity. So the atmosphere is reversed. People are unsettled, not reassured. Now, I think this unease goes back, obviously, further than the recent events in Charlottesville. Trump's election exposed divisions and heightened conflict. His success at the polls shows that the broad consensus that stabilized our political contests in recent decades is coming undone. This consensus was forged in the decades after World War II, and it emphasized deconsolidation, openness, and fluidity. The Princeton historian Daniel Rogers refers to the post-war era as an age of fracture. That's his term, the age of fracture. I prefer to call the last 70 years a Heraclitean age. And the name comes from Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher who said all is flux, that flux and change are the most fundamental things of reality. What did he say about fire? Fire is the primal element because it's always consuming something. So the post-war era, the Heraclitean era, has largely affirmed change and flux as beneficial and even indispensable. But our Heraclitean age has become decadent and dysfunctional. In its place, a new consensus is emerging, or at least trying to emerge. And this new consensus is one that seeks stability and reconsolidation. So those who wish to take responsibility for the future, which I hope is all of us here, and not just in the United States, which will be my topic for today, but in the West more broadly, and perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about that. Those who wish to take responsibility for the future need to understand this need for a new consensus and to try to guide its development. So what I'll do is I'll talk rather extensively about the old Heraclitean consensus and characterize it, and then make my case for why it's dying, and then I will shift it towards the end to try to lay out some principles that I think we can use to help guide the development of what comes next. We're all kind of feeling that. Something is dying, and something is being born. Something is passing away, and something new is coming. And we just don't, we're fearful of that, and rightly so, I should add. But I think it's wise for us to try to think through what role we can play. So, the Heraclitean consensus. In the early 20th century, the exploitation of the working class seemed the most pressing assault on human dignity. After World War II, however, the focus shifted in the United States to racial discrimination. So much so that by the 1960s, anti-discrimination became a crucial priority. We are so thoroughly formed by the post-war consensus that we take this priority for granted. But if we think historically, we have to realize that it came to the fore in the middle of the 20th century for historical reasons. The relatively stable partnership between labor and capital that was established by the New Deal made the problem of the exploitation of the working class seem less pressing. So it rotated out of the center of our political preoccupation. And during the Cold War, racism discredited America internationally. The Russians used our racism as a way, as a propaganda tool. Nonviolent protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. and others brought the brutality of racism before the public eye. Riots in Watts and elsewhere threatened to tear the social fabric. And these and other factors contributed to the shift in political priorities. And it was a shift among the leadership class in America. And that leadership class consolidated around a consensus that ending racial discrimination should be a central imperative. And soon, discrimination against women became a matter of concern as well, and later, discrimination against gays and lesbians. So, by the end of the last decade of the 20th century, anti-discrimination had become an authoritative dogma, so much so that the slightest disloyalty to this dogma now brings severe condemnations. So to be a racist that's the ultimate disqualification for being able to play a role in public life. Now, it's important to recognize that anti-discrimination is a deconsolidating imperative. It seeks to break down barriers, remove impediments, and encourage a more open society. Desegregation involves removing barriers and removing legal barriers and outlawing informal ones. Consciousness raising, another element of the anti-discrimination battle, breaks down stereotypes that structure our engagements with others and does so in rigid and predetermined ways. Feminism requires an even greater cultural deconsolidation. For unlike race, assumptions about the differences between men and women regulate vast swaths of life. Over the last decade, or last half century, these norms that regulate, according to the male-female difference, have been made more plastic and less authoritative, if they have not been removed altogether. So this push for greater fluidity, and that's greater fluidity in terms of race relations, greater fluidity in terms of male-female relations, and it's most obvious, this push for greater fluidity in today's campaign for transgender rights. Obviously, it puts an exclamation mark on the deregulation of the relation between male and female in the transgender rights project. Now, this demand for fluidity and openness broadly characterizes the post-war consensus. As Yuval Levin argues in his recent book, A Fractured Republic, which draws on Daniel Rogers' book, The Age of Fracture. In this book, A Fractured Republic, he observes that the United States in the early 1950s was highly consolidated. He likes the term consolidation. as an image for the social, economic, and political realities. The Great Depression and World War II saw a fundamental transformation of our economy into a system dominated by large companies that worked in close cooperation with government planners. The consolidation was cultural as well as economic. Mass media focused on a narrow range of hit songs and popular TV shows. Now, of course, the 1950s were not altogether rigid and buttoned up. It was also a decade of Allen Ginsberg, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane. But I think it's fair to say that the caricatures of the 1950s have a strong basis in reality. In the 1950s, books such as The Lonely Crowd and Organizational Man lamented what was seen as a pervasive and soul-sapping conformism. And these books were written by liberals. It is an indication of the breadth of the emerging consensus after the war, the emerging consensus in favor of deconsolidation, that in the 1950s, the young William F. Buckley echoed exactly the same concerns in his book, God and Man at Yale. In that book, the driving contrast throughout the book is the contrast between a stifling collectivism and a liberating individualism. So it's telling that David Reisman, a kind of establishment liberal writing The Lonely Crowd, and William F. Buckley, a kind of bomb-throwing conservative writing in God and Man at Yale, are essentially saying the same thing. Our greatest threat is over-consolidation, conformism, collectivism, kind of rigidity, and we need more things to be more open, more fluid, more dynamic. And I think we can go back further still. As World War II ended, Karl Popper published Open Society and Its Enemies, and Friedrich Hayek published The Road to Serfdom. Now, these two authors, like Buckley and Reisman, had quite different views on politics, but they were united in their anxiety about a superordinate consolidating power that would crush human freedom. Now, that's not so it's not surprising then that the post-war consensus sought to emphasize individual freedom and wanted to loosen things up. This was evident during the 1960s, of course, which came to be associated with the New Left and its cultural politics, kind of deregulating especially of sexual mores. But the same dynamic has been at work in the post-war American right. Ronald Reagan's project of economic deregulation was a further stage of a process that began when the Truman administration released Detroit from its wartime quotas of production to go back to producing cars for consumers. And Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s authorized the deregulation of airlines and other government-guaranteed cartels. Then came welfare reform, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, and NAFTA. These and other changes followed the general pattern of deconsolidation, one that works to break down barriers, expand choice, and reduce the interference of government in free market exchanges. And this too became an obligatory bipartisan orthodoxy, just as anti-discrimination became a bipartisan orthodoxy. By the end of the last century, both Democrats and Republicans were leading cheers for Silicon Valley. Just as diversity became a feel-good word for culture, innovation became the buzzword for the economy. Both of those words conjure images of fluidity, openness, and beneficent change. Left and right united around the ideal of a borderless world. Although the left tended to see this ideal in cultural terms, and the right tends to see it in economic terms, both sides adopt a globalist outlook, one in which the formerly closed and consolidated nations of the world were to evolve towards something more fluid and open. In his 2013 inaugural address, President Obama described our future as borderless. And it was an image that he could count on to be received warmly. borderless that in the post-war consensus and the Heraclitean consensus, borderless is received by us as, yes, that would make the world better. That will make life better. That will promote human flourishing. Now, this crude sketch of our cultural and political history over the last 70 years does not do justice to many details. The Cold War encouraged strong affirmations of American patriotism, and that's obviously a consolidating motif, not a deconsolidating one. And the hot wars in Korea and Vietnam kept many economic controls in place, and they were justified by the demands of national security. Nevertheless, I stand by my generalizations. Ours has been a Heraclitean age, one that matured during the decades after World War II. The consensus gave priority to deconsolidating, deregulating initiatives. Now, for years, we have taken this post-war consensus for granted. We all of us assume that rigid, fixed things need to be loosened up and made more open and more porous. The American left emphasizes cultural deregulation and flies the banners of diversity and inclusion, while the American right presses for economic deregulation. And this has obviously led to intense political battles. The left wants less rapid and more narrowly targeted economic deregulation, whereas the right wants less rapid and more narrowly targeted cultural deregulation. But those debates took place within a shared stabilizing consensus. All things considered, this consensus tells us it's best to make things less solid and more fluid. Our culture should become more welcoming and inclusive, and our economy should become more innovative and dynamic. And again, I think left, center, right, center, left debates took those imperatives for granted. Our culture should become more welcoming and inclusive. Our economy should become more innovative and dynamic. And then we'll debate about how to get that done and what goes too far, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, a healthy society develops and sustains a deep consensus that stabilizes political life. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the good people, the boni, the good people, express some variant of the Heraclitean commitment to cultural and economic openness. One must endorse this consensus to be among the responsible people. So we're all to some degree or another feel we need to reaffirm this consensus. To think otherwise makes one an extremist. The problem, however, is that our post-war Heraclitean consensus has become dysfunctional and even destructive. The West has changed a great deal since 1945. 70 years is a long time. And it's changed in large part because things have been so thoroughly opened up economically and culturally. I mean, the success of the consensus has changed. The consensus emerged to remedy an over-consolidated, overly closed, and overly stagnant situation, and it largely succeeded in doing that. And so therefore, the social world and the economic realities that we face are really quite different from those that obtained when the consensus was initially formulated. As a consequence, those of us who imagine that we are defending decency and good policy by campaigning for still greater openness and still greater dynamism are, in fact, more often than not, heightening tensions and undermining the common good. So let me begin with the most obvious example. So my point here being that the dominant consensus, the deregulatory consensus, culturally and economically, has become dysfunctional and even counterproductive. And to argue for it now is actually to pour gasoline onto the current crisis. So let me begin with the most obvious example. And that is the example of the bipartisan project of opening up our economy so that companies and investors can operate globally, so-called globalization. This has eroded the American middle class and contributes to a growing divide in our society. Well-educated urban workers flourish. Meanwhile, middling skilled middle Americans lose out. And a similar dynamic characterizes most economies throughout the Western world. A more open global economy that is less constrained by borders has led to dramatic increases in wealth for tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. It has brought tremendous rewards to the top 1 or 2% in the developed world, which often trickles down into the professional classes. But over the last 2 generations, middle-income workers in the West have seen little or no benefit aside from cheap consumer goods. The growing, and there's a growing cultural chasm, so there's really been no wage growth for middling workers since the 1970s. A growing cultural chasm compounds the growing economic divide. Charles Murray, in his book Coming Apart, documents the shocking differences in divorce, illegitimate children, church-going, civic involvement, labor participation, and other basic indicators of flourishing. Well-to-do and well-educated Americans seem to manage quite nicely in our deregulated culture, while those at the bottom of the social scale increasingly live dysfunctional lives in dysfunctional communities. Recent data analysis by Ann Case and Angus Deaton show that white males with a high school degree or less are far more likely to die of drug overdose, suicide, or alcohol-related disease than are those with 4-year college degrees or more. I think they're 4 times more likely to die of those so-called deaths of despair than people like us. So it seems that economic deregulation has created problems that reinforce and are reinforced by the cultural deregulation designed to make society less repressive and more inclusive. Now, the main elements in the post-war consensus, and I want to emphasize this, were not wrong-headed. Economic deregulation was a fitting imperative some decades ago. Our economy was too centralized and immobile. And the same can be said for anti-discrimination and its efforts to deregulate culture. Jim Crow and the informal boundaries erected by racism had to be broken down. The rigid sex roles for men and women needed to be relaxed. And these efforts remain useful to some degree. We should continue to repeal bad economic regulations. And we should continue to work against unjust discrimination. But, and here's my emphasis, but a political consensus establishes priorities. You can't do everything in public life. And a political consensus is about what our biggest problems are and then how we should approach them. So, the priorities of the post-war consensus are out of sync with present-day realities. The efforts to loosen controls and open things up solved some problems of an over-consolidated economy and a too rigid society. Today, however, our problems are quite different. In fact, in many instances, they are exactly the opposite. America, and the West more broadly, is afflicted by too much flux, not too much rigidity. There is very little left that is solid and fixed. And in this context, which is our context, the Heraclitean consensus only makes things worse. In 1950, the illegitimacy rate of black women was less than 20%. Now it is more than 70%. It is a sign of the decadence of the post-war consensus that scholars and pundits on the left redefine this moral crisis as a consequence of racial discrimination, inadequate access to contraception, or the insufficient influence of feminism in the black community. These explanations amount to the claim that we have not deregulated culture enough. It's also a sign of the decadence of decadence that scholars and pundits on the right insist that the collapse of the middle class in America stems from the fact that the taxes on the wealthy are too high and that we have too much economic regulation. The preoccupation of today's liberal and conservative establishments are no longer plausible. And both lines of thinking contribute to the increasingly obvious blindness of our leadership class. And this blindness, caused by a rigid and dogmatic loyalty to the dysfunctional Heraclitean consensus, is destabilizing our political culture. An atmosphere of unreality obtains when newspapers preoccupy themselves with stories about female representation in C-suites and on corporate boards, as if the great social problem our society faces is whether or not already rich women can get even richer. Now, Donald Trump ran on protectionism and economic nationalism. He made harsh statements about illegal immigrants, and more recently, he launched attacks on NFL players who kneel during the national anthem to protest what they see as ongoing discrimination against young black men. His administration threatens to scuttle NAFTA and impose tariffs. These actions have inflamed opposition to Trump's leadership, often unifying center-right and center-left pundits and politicians who denounce him as irresponsible. Recently, former Presidents Obama and Bush gave speeches widely interpreted as public rebukes to Trump. The resistance is to be expected. Whatever one thinks of Trump's personality or politics, there is no doubt that he represents a rejection of the post-war emphasis on cultural and economic deregulation and deconsolidation. Insofar as the Heraclitean consensus is integral to our system, and I think you could say that it is, our regime, let's call it our regime, our cultural political regime, Trump's rise to power threatens our system, threatens our regime. So they're not wrong to see him as illegitimate, because legitimacy is defined by the dominant consensus. For this reason, the election of Donald Trump is politically and culturally significant in a way that the election of Hillary Clinton would not have been. He is the first presidential candidate since George Wallace to run against the post-war consensus, and he won. And this contrast to Wallace, who got 13% of the popular vote. This does not suggest that America is more racist and more economically populist than it was in 1968. And those who think otherwise are profoundly out of touch with reality. Trump's ascendancy tells us that the Heraclitean consensus is breaking down. In 2016, a large number of voters signaled that they no longer think cultural and economic deregulation are priorities. I think that's, to me, what Trump's victory suggests. A large number of voters, perhaps a growing number of voters, no longer think that cultural and economic deregulation should be our political priorities. Now, as Christians living in the early 21st century, we are socialized, all of us, into the Heraclitean view. We're inclined to see anti-discrimination as central and even as the overriding imperative. Our sentiments tend to run in a globalist direction, with borders as necessary perhaps, but essentially regrettable. And we're likely to cheer innovation and praise economic dynamism. But we need to think soberly about what Trump's electoral victory says about our present cultural, economic, and social realities. So, solidarity. Solidarity is a central concept in Catholic social doctrine, and it can help orient us as we try to think about where should we stand in this time of change. This notion draws our attention to the centripetal forces in society, the loves and loyalties that bind us together. Now, the family provides an obvious example. Sports teams are often precious experiences of solidarity for young people as they grow up. And this means more than just mere interdependence. We rely on others to fly airplanes, cook our meals, and do many other functions. But these relationships can be cold and transactional. Solidarity, by contrast, involves something warm. It evokes from us a spirit of mutual commitment, even sacrifice. According to Catholic social teaching, a healthy society requires solidarity. I mean, a healthy society has to be characterized by solidarity. Solidarity is not something you can require in a legal sense. And this, of course, includes civic solidarity. Now, the common good is a closely related concept. It refers to the goods that we share in common, not to GDP or other aggregates of utility. These goods are social in a fundamental sense. They're not goods that we can enjoy in private, and they are not diminished when they are shared. For example, marital union is a common good, but marital union cannot be divided and parceled out to a divorcing couple. It can only exist insofar as it's shared. And the rule of law is another common good. It only exists as a social reality, never as a private one. And unlike my bank account, the rule of law is strengthened, not depleted, when others share in it. So the common good is both something that can only be a good insofar as it's shared, and it's also a good that is strengthened insofar as it is more widely shared. By my reading of the signs of the times, the political upheavals of the last 2 years, not just in America but in Europe as well, suggest a deep crisis in solidarity, a diminished capacity to speak about the common good, and as a consequence, a paradoxical loss of freedom. Paradoxical because you would think that deregulation would lead to greater freedom, but it's paradoxically not so. And these problems flow from the decadence and dogmatism of the Heraclitean consensus, or at least they are, we're prevented from addressing them because of the decadence and dogmatism of the Heraclitean consensus. The imperative of cultural deregulation and its emphasis on fighting discrimination now undermines solidarity, especially civic solidarity. This was not true when Martin Luther King Jr. fought racial discrimination. He drew upon America's double inheritance, both the biblical tradition and the ideals articulated by the founders. In his rhetoric, the sin of racism was not just a violation of human dignity. It was a sin insofar as it excluded black Americans from their proper inheritance as Americans. And it was an inheritance that King evoked so beautifully in his speeches. We've come a long way since the 1960s. Today's rhetoric of anti-discrimination and identity politics makes solidarity suspect. I'm struck by the regularity with which commentators redescribe the conventional patriotism of Middle America as ethno-nationalism, as if it were a primitive and destructive sentiment. An institution such as Providence College, for example, to give a different example, it increasingly cannot unite in solidarity as a Catholic institution, for to do so would, of course, exclude or create an atmosphere of exclusion of non-Catholics. All we are permitted these days is an ersatz unity of identity, which is more often a shared grievance rather than solidarity and a shared love. Solidarity does not just happen. It requires leadership that renews the sacred bonds that unite. Beholden to the Heraclitean consensus, our leaders have great difficulty doing this today. They fear violating the imperatives of inclusion. Now, Donald Trump himself makes clumsy statements about national solidarity, as well as perhaps cynical statements that serve his interests. It's open for debate, to be sure. But they resonate. These statements resonate because they echo in a vacuum. Responsible leadership today means filling this vacuum with richer, more nuanced, and nobler accounts of our shared inheritance as Americans. It also means renewing the covenant of marriage and the integrity of the church. At the end of the Heraclitean age, the pent-up desire for solidarity. I think there's a tremendous pent-up desire for solidarity. That this pent-up desire can easily lead to an idolatry of the nation. The best defense against this perversion is to renew the more fundamental solidarity of marriage and the supernatural solidarity of the body of Christ. Now, the crisis of solidarity is closely related to our inability to speak about the common good. The libertarian and individualist anthropology of neoclassical economic theory reduces common goods to aggregates of individual interests. This is fine as a technique for modeling human behavior. It can be quite useful. But it becomes perverse when it dominates our political vocabulary. Real people do not enter into a social contract. They are born into, or in some cases freely join, a living community that arouses in them a powerful loyalty. During the campaign season, a reporter went to North Carolina to see if Trump's support there was strong among those who lost their jobs when the furniture making industry moved to China. And the writer of this New York Times story was baffled that the strongest support for Trump came from those who had not lost their jobs, rather than from those who had lost their jobs. The reporter's political imagination had become impoverished, and I would suggest that our leadership class, their political imaginations have become impoverished. He could not see that those who survive the tidal waves of globalization are concerned about the future of their communities. They live for what they share with others and not just for themselves. Now, postmodern deconstruction in its various forms also degrades our civic imaginations. It's simply false that those worried about preserving a distinctively American way of life are racists or anti-immigrant or patriarchal or whatever other derogation you might want to choose. It is healthy to desire a stable, secure civic home and an honorable national inheritance to pass down to our children. We need to discard, however misguided people's effort to fulfill that desire may be, the desire itself is a healthy one. We need to discard reductive assumptions about our fellow citizens. We naturally seek to be loyal to something greater than ourselves. And that something must be concrete and not abstract. One can no more become a citizen of the world than get married to the whole world. We have to take up a residence in a place and share in the destiny of a particular people in order to share in a common good. I would say there is no such thing. There is no global common good because there is no entity that can share in it. In his major speeches, Trump does not employ the usual rhetoric of freedom. This is a very striking departure. George W. Bush often called for more freedom, and Barack Obama had his own way of evoking a more open and more dynamic world. Trump, by contrast, appeals to solidarity and national unity. And some commentators describe this rhetoric as dark, closed, and authoritarian. These are derogatory terms meant to dramatize the threats Trump poses. By violating the Heraclitean consensus, Trump, by this way of thinking, or this fear, Trump is leading us back to racism, fascism, and Auschwitz. But we are not living in Weimar Germany, nor are we living in the Jim Crow South. Our society offers individuals unprecedented freedom. I could raise capital in Dubai, hire software designers in Silicon Valley, build factories in Thailand, and sell my product to the entire world on the internet. I can watch unlimited pornography, indulge in profane rants on television, and dress like a woman. And yet, for all this remarkable freedom, we are increasingly subject to a pervasive and paralyzing anxiety. Freedom requires that we have a solid place to stand. But the Heraclitean consensus dissolves and deregulates. And this requires us to swim in a perpetual flux. And to swim 24/7 is exhausting. And it leads to a paradoxical bondage in a time when so much is permitted. Responsible citizenship requires knowing the reality of the society in which you are a citizen. My message today is that we are not afflicted by too much permanence or overly rigid boundaries. Instead, we're drowning in a liquid world. And we're desperate for something solid and reliable. Calls for trigger warnings and safe spaces, as well as denunciations of cultural appropriation. These suggest as much. They express a desire for security and repose, as well as for an inheritance of one's own, something that's not for sale. Something similar is at work in white nationalism, paradoxically, which is also about recovering a safe space and protecting a heritage from appropriation. So it seems to me that this odd convergence of destructive extremes indicates that our main problems today are not rigidity, over-consolidation, and a lack of openness. On the contrary, we're afflicted by insecurity, fears of homelessness, and the suspicion that we don't have anything honorable to pass down to our children. It seems to me that we're entering a time of crisis. Anti-Trump outrage and warnings about impending disaster have been constant for nearly 2 years. This has been an impressive display of the Heraclitean consensus, but it has been shown to be politically impotent. This impotence puts us on edge, for it foretells the end of an era. But it also suggests that we are gaining the freedom to formulate a new consensus, which is what I think we desperately need. It must not be a consensus. This new consensus must be one that does justice to the truths taught by Parmenides, the ancient philosopher who argued that permanence and changelessness undergird reality. Now, a Parmenidean consensus also poses dangers. To lash a society too closely to what is unchanging makes it rigid, unwelcoming, and unproductive. But change is coming, and I think it's a change that we should welcome. However cautiously, we should be very cautious, but we should welcome it. For we've become unmoored, homeless, and insecure. Too much Heraclitus encourages us to adopt a self-protective, untrusting outlook, and it makes us vulnerable to demagogues. It's time for Parmenides to have his say in the politics of the 21st century. And as those who trust in the enduring and unfailing promises of Christ, we should take the lead in shaping this new consensus. Our foremost responsibilities, I believe, as Christians, will be to aid in the reconsolidation of the West, which means the renewal of that which is solid and enduring. Thank you.
I'm going to assume that stimulates a few questions. Our tradition is, which we made up one day, by the way, our tradition is to begin with students and then move on to professors, because if we go the other way, no student ever raises their hand. So I see some bright young faces out there. Yep.
Would you say that the rise of that Heraclitean consensus is related to the rise of postmodernism and rejecting any kind of ordered view of looking at the world?
Yes, I mean, that's its decadent phase, right? Someone like Derrida, who comes of age he's from Algeria, a Jew, secular Jew from Algeria, so who comes to do his PhD in Paris in the late 1950s when the kind of Marxist ideology, Stalinist ideology exerted extremely rigid control over intellectual life at the Sorbonne. I would have been, if I were him, I'd be in favor of dissolving everything, because all the solid things were instruments of destruction of human beings. It felt like, whether it's anti-Semitism, Auschwitz, or colonialism, Algeria, and the passions that it arose, or the ideological passions of Marxism. So it's perfectly understandable. And then it takes on a life of its own, and it becomes this kind of deconstruction becomes not a technique so much as a stance, and it winds up dissolving, destabilizing everything. That's its claim. Everything sort of is, the foundations of everything it's a deception to think that they're solid. Everything is undermined in some way. And I think that why is it so popular in academia? Well, because this is a kind of scholasticism for the Heraclitean consensus. Yeah. And there are other forms, but I think Derrida's sort of the most interesting and sort of intellectually rigorous version of it.
You mentioned that Christianity should be at the forefront of this reconsolidation.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways do you see that should be the case?
Well, I think to go back to deconstruction, I think we should be in the business of trying to revive metaphysical thinking. These are things to argue about. It's not like we have some answers. There's no revealed truths about metaphysics. But a place like Providence College, if it was serious about it, about playing a role in trying to help the Parmenidean, the return of Parmenides, then it would be to make sure we actually know what we're talking about when we start to talk about permanent things.
Hello. So you described a desire for stability and a desire for stability and security and tradition, and the sort of patriotic impulse oriented towards that as a noble impulse, even if in application sometimes it is misguided. What specifically, what period, what lifestyle, what values do you see that patriotism and desire for stability being oriented towards? And at what point in American history did the most people, regardless of living in rural or urban areas, of being Catholic or Protestant, rich or poor, when did they share in it?
Well, the high water mark is obviously 1945. That's the high water mark. We effectively shut down immigration out of anxieties that the country was going to lose its capacity to consolidate around a single narrative, so to speak, in 1924, and then the successfully defeating the economic enemy of the Great Depression, and then successfully defeating, the Japanese and the Germans. That created a tremendous sense of shared common purpose, of which African Americans were excluded. So everybody kind of largely came together, and African Americans not on the outside. So you have to. That's a high water mark. I don't want to go back to that. Part of it is you can't create the conditions of solidarity. You can't engineer it. Instead, we have to tell a story about who we are. And that story in 2017 is not going to be the same story as was told in 1945. It's not going to be the same story that was told in 1898 or 1865. But we have to take the risk of a meta-narrative about what it means to be an American, and argue about it, debate about it. How do we do this? But that it's a good thing. That's the thing, is that I go and I travel, and people dispute whether it's a good thing for a country to have a unifying narrative. Because it's always going to exclude. A unifying narrative always excludes, in the sense that it excludes people who have a different narrative. You know, it excludes people who dissent from the narrative. You can't have solidarity and kind of plenary inclusion at the same time. Solidarity is uniting around a shared love. And if people don't like that love or opposed to that love or ambivalent about that love, then they're at the periphery of, and not at the center of the shared project. So I think as Americans, we need to figure out what is our shared love? And we have a kind of weird country, which is that our shared love is both a certain history and place, but it's also some ideas and principles. And I happen to think that if it's just a place and just a history, it's not actually America, right? But if it's just abstract ideas about equality, it's also not America. It's that weird fusion that we have where you know, our civil religion it's Christian sort of, you know, but not really. And we're a historical nation that emerges out of a kind of Anglo-Protestant history, and that's integral to who we are. But we're also a lot more than that. We also have ideas that sort of are constantly agitating the complacency of that particular historical sense of identity, and that's a fruitful tension, I think. And we need to recover that.
Thank you, Professor. So it's very inspiring. So just two undergraduate questions, so don't be nervous.
Okay.
So first, I want
to. Are you a
to.
poor country lawyer?
Sorry?
Are you a poor country lawyer?
Sorry, I cannot get that.
I think that's just like those two undergraduate
Okay.
questions.
So first, I want to say, can I use some Hegelian idea to explain, to understand your whole speech?
Yes.
I can do that. Oh, that's great. Okay. Okay. And the second thing, so you just mentioned about the development of American society. It seems there's a civil religion, and according to some Hegelian historical thesis, there's always conflict. So we always need new kind of tension to. It's not a bad thing.
That's right.
It's just like your body needs germ to keep yourself healthy.
No, that's my point. I think that the Declaration of Independence it has high ideals, but at the same time, as I said, you know, it's not the case that this is our mistake in Iraq. We can't take freedom and Americanize the world, because to be an American is to have certain habits of mind, certain range of feelings, a certain set of emotional kind of an emotional structure, a certain love of the particular place, and we shouldn't deceive ourselves into thinking that we're just a liberal philosophy that happens to be in North America. I mean, I think we are a liberal nation, and that liberal philosophy is in our DNA. So that, I think, provides the tension, which is why someone can come from Cambodia to the United States, become a citizen, and enter into the argument about what our country is.
Professor, may I have one more question? So make sure I understand you clearly. So as you said, so in the last few years, the trend should be deconsolidation or something like that, or the pursuit of dynamicisms. But right now, I think as Mr. Trump was elected as president, and I think that can represent certain amount of people want to have ordered society.
Yeah, order is another way of talking about reconsolidation, Parmenides, permanence. Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you very much.
All right, I guess we can go to professors, but I'll go back to students.
Before I speak, are there any more students want to ask questions? Okay. I am very puzzled by this mysterious sin called cultural appropriation. For example, a couple summers ago, we saw a beautiful performance. We heard a beautiful performance by a Japanese artist of Bach's cello suites. As far as I can tell, current dogma on this issue, he was guilty of a massive sin and should have been subject to public humiliation for appropriating German culture. Now, to me, this seems insanity, but a lot of people seem to believe it. In terms of your analysis of our society, how did we ever come up with such a, to be blunt, lunatic idea that there was such a sin as cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I'm more sympathetic to people who talk about this, and I'm not sympathetic. It is a diseased response to a real problem. What is a real problem? Everything is for sale. My citizenship is not for sale. If in the kind of cultural politics of 2017, whether you're an artist or a musician, your success depends upon wrapping yourself in some kind of, some sort of cape of oppression or marginalization. That's how you make it in the academy. You all know this. So if I'm a black American, at some point it's like, this is for sale too. My history is for sale. So these people are going to take it and use it and advance their career. Just like somebody will take, American history or my heritage and market it and pervert it because they can make money with it. It's the same dynamic. So I'm sympathetic to that. Now, it's a diseased response. It doesn't get to what the real problem is. But the real problem is that we've created a marketplace we've created a kind of cultural marketplace for oppression, marginalization, and all that kind of stuff, and turned it into a good that we can use to advance ourselves or silence people or in other ways exercise power. And so I think it's a healthy response, to be honest with you. And not healthy, it's a diseased response, but the underlying intuition is correct. I got a little heated on that one, I'm sorry.
I appreciated your discussion of the fluidity within late modernity because for me it was reminiscent of Zygmunt Bauman's text, Liquid Modernity,
Yes.
also the Marxist humanist Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air. But I wanted to talk to you as regards how this fluidity affects working class white Americans as you described. There's been an interesting discourse over the past 30 years among paleoconservative intellectuals such as the Rockford Institute regarding globalization, the loss of jobs, etc., a sense of a loss of community, in other words. But the popular press within the United States, and I was out of the country while Trump was running for office, but I still noticed that there was a distinct absence of a knowledge of intellectual history within that particular conservative phylogeny, if you will. In other words, that concept of protectionism, isolationism, nationalism had been discussed in the 70s and 80s. Donald Warren's PhD dissertation at Michigan, the Radical Center, Middle American Radicalism, Samuel Francis, Joseph Sabran, late of National Review, and yet the journalists at major newspapers and organs of opinions didn't pick up on this. They simply understood Trump as reactive. And I think essentially it's an ignorance of American intellectual culture that prompted this hysterical response.
Well, I think you're quite right. It's interesting. The left has been more. You mentioned Berman's book and then Bauman. The left has been more aware of the Heraclitean perils but they tend to see it only in economic terms. That capitalism, creative destruction as a virtue of capitalism has the vice of destruction and destroying solid things. And they don't tend to see how the cultural politics of the last two generations have also been liquefying in their own way. And as I said, they interact very powerfully together for, and I wouldn't say white working class, I would say working class people across the board. The data is quite clear that, as I say, sort of economic abandonment and cultural abandonment together, are having fatal consequences. It's just, as I said, you look at the stats on life prospects by class in the United States, and it's shocking. And there is a very powerful cultural component to this. Very difficult to navigate in a world without clear rules. And the deregulatory project in culture has been to get rid of the rules. Everything is up for negotiation. And, if we're going to negotiate and sort of talk things through to make my own personal decision, that requires a lot of verbal skills, and even then, people don't do a very good job. So why is the press? It's because of the power of the Heraclitean consensus. Everybody's socialized into this consensus. And so the intellectual history that you recounted is all the people you described are extremists, right? So of course you don't study them or know about them, because you want to be a responsible member of, you want to be among the bony, the good people, exercising responsible citizenship according to the principles that are widely accepted as promoting the common good. And my speech tonight, this afternoon, is that consensus is breaking down. And it's breaking down because it's become decadent. This is to be expected. It is a long time since 1945. That's a long time ago. I was thinking about it. The Civil War ended in 1865, and my father was born in 1933, so he was born 70 years after the end of the Civil War. And of course the Civil War still influenced American politics. That's why the white Southerners were Democrats. But, wow, the industrial age, First World War, so much had been transformed that it would be very odd and of course that's why the consensus that dominated American society from the end of the Civil War until 1929, we were dominated by a sort of business-oriented Republican do-goodism political consensus, leavened by Wilsonian progressivism. And that came crashing down after 1929, and a new consensus emerged. So we're at the end of that consensus. So maybe some of the people that you mentioned are going to come back as being salient as we try to think about things in the future.
You mentioned marriage several times as a prime instance of solidarity, the pursuit of a common good. I'd just be interested for you to say a little bit more about how you see marriage being renewed.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Marriage is for most people, they do not contemplate philosophically. And so for most people, their encounter with permanence as a metaphysical reality is when they take the vows, the wedding vows. That's their experience. And so it seems to me that the disillusion of the culture of marriage among all but the upper class is at the root of this feeling of rootlessness, homelessness, and a sense of being adrift in a world with no permanence. And I personally would like to have a dynamic economy, an open economy. I don't want to roll back the global economic system. And I don't want to return to the kind of conformism that characterized the United States in the 1950s. But if if we're going to do that, it's hard to see how we have to have marriage as a place of stability. And that allows people to go into the world where there's lots of flux, because they have a place to return to, a sense of repose, a place of rest, a place where they can trust that that there's something there that's not going to betray them. And I think it's very hard. I think nationalism is a great threat, precisely because it's a kind of surrogate permanence, surrogate loyalty for marriage. Marriage it limits the state from below, and religion limits the state from above. And I'm worried that both of those covenants, the religious covenant and the marital covenant, are very much weakened, and people are going to rush to the national covenant as a surrogate for all those things. And it can't bear that weight, and it becomes an idol when we try to make it do that. But we're not going to, it's just gasoline on the fire to denounce the desire for patriotic loyalty. I mean, that just throws gasoline on the fire. Because, that you're just, so we're in a hard spot. That doesn't answer your question of how to renew marriage. I don't know how to renew marriage. It can't be engineered, that's for sure.
So the way I see it is that the millennials are the last ones coming of age in the Heraclitean period. So we know there were previous foundations. A lot of them haven't been forgotten, but a lot of them have not been implemented in our lives. So we're the ones responsible now for bringing in the new generation. So if there's anything we can do to really bring back some sort of stability, even though we've grown up without a lot of stability in our lives, just sort of memories of what it used to be, some sort of golden past. How can we bring that back into the present?
Well, I mean, you have an educational institution. It has a distinctive tradition. To be loyal to that tradition, I think, is a witness. The constancy of Providence College's educational mission, I think, is very important. It's very tempting to sort of say, well, we want to open it up, right? Providence College, we're going to open it up so that it's welcoming to all people. And to do that, you have to downplay the distinctively Catholic character of the institution, because if you're not Catholic, then you won't feel as that you really belong. And I think this is counterproductive. I think that young people today are happy to be anywhere where people are loyal to, and not just on the make. And like I say, everything is for sale. At most universities, the faculty are teaching there. At most universities, faculty it's a place where they're advancing their careers. So they're not loyal to the place. And the students aren't loyal to the institution. It's this machine of meritocratic self-advancement. And I think that, if you have your great books curriculum, it's a very distinctive one, and you're loyal to it, you're sending a message to these students that things come, things go, but these things stay. And we believe in those things. We're not going to sell them. We're not going to sell them out or betray them. And I think that's a powerful witness. And we all have to do this in our small way to try to rebuild the elements of solidity, healthy solidity, things that are worth and noble and deserve our loyalty, so that in the coming crisis, people don't throw themselves into the arms of ignoble things that don't deserve our loyalty.
Number 3? Okay. Oh, then Chris will have. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate everything. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. I've changed my question about 5 times, given what else has been said. But maybe I want to follow up a little bit with what Matthew said, because I was really struck by, you were talking about very kind of global ideas and problems and questions, and kept throwing in marriage, which is a very concrete and very personal and very localized. I mean, it's about the most localized commitment that you could make. One of the things I've been struck by in my own experience in teaching is how often students, or how much students have absorbed the idea that everything is about power. And I'm not that old, and I have been trained in kind of a more religious, or I have more religious commitments. But what I was always taught is that everything is about love, or the breakdown of love. And it's very hard to move from that worldview in which, and I think that's what you're saying, is that everything is about power to everything is about love. Because if it's about power, then there's a particular way of thinking about freedom, which I think you were, it's throwing off that power, throwing off anything that restricts me, and yet love is all about making commitment, sacrificing, all of these things. I was just wondering if you wanted to follow up on that or talk a little bit more about that, because I think you put your finger on something. There is something peculiar about the breakdown of marriage, and I don't mean what a lot of people mean by that, but what I mean is that inability to make a long-term permanent commitment to another person and a family. I think that's where it's the center of the problem.
Education, Plato recognizes that when you're 18 and you arrive at Providence College, you awaken to the fact that things are not as they seem. You know, that the things that you believed are in some sense superficial and mere matters of shared opinion and not examined and so on. And so you want to think critically, right? And for the last 2 generations, consensus has taken hold among educators that if you want to pierce the veil, you know, if you want to leave the cave of illusion, you have to go down. You go down. You go down to things that are more base, you know, that are more primitive, that are more, that make us more like animals. So what really makes the world go around is power, sex, desire for wealth, these sorts of things. So I think it's pervasive. We all go down. In fact, I was at a meeting about economic policy and all that kind of stuff, and I was very struck that the participants under 45 assumed that liberals have created a racket, and that they've organized the sort of global economic system to enhance and sustain their wealth and power. And I realized, wow, this is, I mean, of course it's always true because we're fallen we're fallen human beings. But for Plato, you go up and you saturate your mere opinion with a higher truth. And you don't go down. And our educational system exclusively goes down because the operative metaphysics is materialist in one form or another. So all of our leadership class operates this way. And there's no sense that a progressive is trying to serve the common good. You know, they've got the wrong assumptions. They're making mistakes. It's tinctured with self-serving motives, all those kinds of things. But that, you know, that you have to convert people by showing them, no, this is what you really ought to love, and this is the way to get there. So it's kind of a long-winded way of doing it, but I think I've come to see that this going down for the truth, to illuminate, it doesn't really illuminate, it kind of, because there's no light there, but it explains, as opposed to going up and illuminating. I mean, I kind of theory I've come to see that thinking theoretically, whether it's is to saturate your thoughts about the world with something greater, more breadth, more depth of comprehension. Theories don't provide you with answers to questions about what justice or what policies you ought to be promoting, or what moral positions you ought to be taking. So.
Yes, you had mentioned the need for stability and the family as a source for stability, and you had also mentioned the need to concretize the abstract. That, you know, nobody loves an abstraction, and no agent who loves is an abstraction, you know, that everything ultimately has to be particularized and concretized, so that need for particularity and stability. And also you spoke about the need of civic friendship. Well, one of the things that I think intensifies civic friendship was the ethnic neighborhood, something like, you know, an Irish Catholic neighborhood or an Italian Catholic neighborhood. And because added to the normal human similarities, you're human, I'm human, was also certain cultural similarities. You spoke the same language, you had the same culture, you sang the same songs, and you know, you had that sort of solidarity super added to the normal human solidarity of these particular solidarities, right? And you know, that the ethnic neighborhood, so there's a kind of civic friendship that arises spontaneously from the ethnic neighborhood, and that minimizes the need for the coercive apparatus of the state and state power. There's a kind of, if you like, there's a broader family, you know, we all live in the same neighborhood, we're all Italians or Catholics and such like that, and we speak the same language. I'm just going to give you an example. One example was taken from, that sociologists have noted, was taken from one of the Irish Catholic neighborhoods, right? And an outsider came into the neighborhood and tried to sell pornography to the youth of the neighborhood. And the fathers, if you like, the prominent fathers of the neighborhood, they got together and they just simply beat the guy up, right? And problem solved, end of problem. He didn't come in there, they just simply said. And so, anyway, and also, you know, I would also, you know, point out other, you know, you mentioned the illegitimacy rates, and so I'm just saying, do a lot of our problems stem in a way from the destruction, for whatever reason, and however it came out, of the ethnic neighborhood, because it was, whether it was Italian or Catholic, you know, whatever, or Anglo, the Anglo ethnic neighborhood, something like Beacon Hill or something like that. Does that play a role in our current crisis, would you say? Or do we need to revive this notion of the ethnic neighborhood, the union of the universal human with the particular cultural? So, anyway.
Maybe I'm deluded, but I think being an American is a particular identity. So I think that could be a sufficient basis for a neighborhood. But you're right that in this sense, obviously there's historical periods that have where our sense of community takes different forms, and that was a very important period. But we don't, and there are ethnic communities in New York now, still, very powerful ones. The guy who cuts my hair, Bukhari, a Jew from Baku, Azerbaijan, just like everybody else in the barbershop. They're all guys, and they're about 30 years old, who are special strand of Judaism in Central Asia, and they all live in the same neighborhood. And it's obvious that this creates a very tremendous amount of social capital because they support each other, and that's all for the best. Yeah, we need to figure out how to renew communal, functional communities for, you know, vast swaths of Americans that don't live in functional communities, and that's not going to be easy. Well, part of it is, yeah. I mean, part of my talk, I don't have any policy answers, but my purpose of my talk is to say that's the crisis. The crisis is the disillusion of the unifying solid things, and you know, people don't want to hear this, but that is a huge crisis. It is, and the crisis is not discrimination. That's a problem. It's bad. We should do what we can, but you can't do everything. And you have to ask yourself, what's the biggest problem? What's the real threat? The biggest threat, to my mind, is, well, dissolving middle class, which is the foundation of our democracy, without which I think we'll be ruled by an increasingly globalized oligarchy. And I don't want to live in that kind of political regime. We already have it in part. and I don't want to live in that kind of regime. And so politically, it seems to me, we have a spiritual crisis that's related to this kind of rise of these deaths of despair, and we have a political crisis, to my mind, which is a crisis of a functional democracy, which requires a vast swath of self-confident people who know where they stand in the world and who can hold their people who are wealthier and more powerful accountable and aren't just easily manipulated or in some way despairing or disengaged. So that strikes to my mind is the big crisis, and we ought to be, and to meet that crisis, we have to have a Parmenidean rhetoric, a rhetoric of reconsolidation. And it's not Trump's rhetoric. He doesn't have, it's very crude and in many respects self-serving. So we have to step up and provide, it seems to me, a more noble rhetoric of reconsolidation. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.